March 1943, North Atlantic. The water is black and cold, moving in long, silent swells beneath a sky thick with cloud. Somewhere beneath the surface, a German U-boat glides at periscope depth, her diesel silent, her crew listening. For 2 years, these waters have belonged to them, hunting grounds where Allied convoys moved in predictable lines, where tonnage sank faster than it could be replaced, where the war could still be won by starvation. But something has changed. The radio man reports it first, fewer signals from neighboring boats, then fewer still. By mid-month, entire wolf packs have gone silent. The commanders do not yet understand what is happening. They do not yet realize that the Atlantic, which gave them so much, is about to take everything back. This is not a story of sudden reversal. It is a story of accumulation, of small technological shifts compounding into strategic collapse, of industrial capacity outpacing tactical brilliance, of men who believed themselves invincible, discovering that invincibility was never permanent. The German U-boat force, which in early 1943 stood at the height of its power, would by year's end be hemorrhaging crews at a rate that made continued operations unsustainable. The question is not whether they lost. The question is how an advantage so pronounced could evaporate so completely in so short a time. To understand what happened after 1943, you must first understand what came before. The U-boat war began as a technological and tactical marvel. Germany entered the war with fewer than 60 operational submarines, but the men who commanded them had learned hard lessons from the First World War. They understood that surface fleets could not challenge British naval supremacy. They understood that merchant tonnage was the true lifeline of an island nation. And they understood that submarines, operating in coordinated groups, could exploit the vast emptiness of the Atlantic in ways no surface raider ever could. Karl Donitz, the architect of the U-boat strategy, had developed the concept of the wolf pack, Rudel tactic, in the years before the war. The idea was simple. Instead of lone submarines hunting independently, boats would be directed by shore-based command to converge on convoys, overwhelming escort defenses through mass and coordination. It required precise communication, aggressive captains, and above all, an ocean large enough to hide in. For the first 3 years of the war, they had all three. The numbers tell the story. In 1940, U-boats sank over 2 million tons of Allied shipping. In 1941, over 2 million more. In 1942, over 6 million. Coastal cities went dark to avoid giving submarines navigational landmarks. Convoys sailed with inadequate escorts. Ships sank faster than they could be built. Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. This was not rhetoric. Britain's ability to continue fighting depended entirely on the Atlantic remaining open. If the convoys stopped, the war stopped. German submariners in this period lived a strange, contradictory existence. They were an elite force, volunteers drawn from the most capable men in the Kriegsmarine, and yet their daily lives were defined by discomfort that bordered on the surreal. A Type 7 U-boat, the workhorse of the Atlantic campaign, was just over 200 feet long and 20 feet wide. 50 men lived inside it for patrols lasting 2 months or more. There were no showers, there was one toilet, and when the boat dove deep, it could not be used. The air grew thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, diesel fuel, mildew, and rotting food. Bread went moldy within days. Condensation dripped constantly from the steel hull. Men slept in shifts, crammed into bunks so narrow they had to lie on their sides. And yet, they believed. They believed in their mission. They believed in their commanders. They believed in the technical superiority of their boats and the skill of their crews. Most of all, they believed that the war could be won at sea, that if they sank enough ships, Britain would be forced to negotiate, and Germany would achieve the security it sought. This belief sustained them through conditions that would have broken other men. The typical patrol followed a rhythm. A boat would leave port, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and transit through the Bay of Biscay, running on the surface at night to recharge batteries, diving during the day to avoid Allied aircraft. Once in the operational area, usually the mid-Atlantic where air cover did not reach, the boat would begin its patrol, moving slowly, scanning the horizon for smoke, listening for the sound of propellers through the hydrophones. When a convoy was located, the boat would radio its position to shore command. Other boats in the area would be vectored in. They would wait until nightfall, then surface and attack from multiple directions, exploiting the darkness and the confusion. It worked. For a long time it worked better than anyone in Berlin had dared hope. Allied convoys suffered staggering losses. Escort vessels, mostly older destroyers and corvettes, lacked the speed to chase down surfaced U-boats and the detection equipment to find submerged ones. Torpedoes struck without warning. Men died in burning oil slicks or froze in lifeboats that drifted for days. The survivors, when they returned to port, brought stories of helplessness, of watching ships explode and being unable to do anything but maintain formation and pray their own vessel was not next. But the Allies were learning. Slowly, incrementally, they were solving the problem of the U-boat. The solutions were not dramatic. They were procedural, industrial, and relentless. Escort carriers, small mass-produced vessels built on merchant hulls, began to close the mid-Atlantic air gap. Long-range B-24 Liberators flying from bases in Iceland, Newfoundland, and Northern Ireland extended patrol coverage deeper into the ocean. Radar sets, initially crude and unreliable, improved to the point where they could detect a surfaced submarine at night from several miles away. High-frequency direction-finding equipment, HFDUF, allowed escorts to triangulate U-boat radio transmissions and vector ships toward them. Depth charges became more powerful and more numerous. Hedgehog mortars, which fired multiple small bombs in a forward arc, allowed escorts to attack without losing sonar contact. None of these technologies was revolutionary on its own, but together, compounded across hundreds of convoy battles, they began to shift the balance. The ocean, which had been a refuge, became contested space. The night, which had been an ally, became dangerous. The radio, which had enabled coordination, became a liability. The U-boat men did not notice the shift all at once. They noticed it in small ways. Patrols that once lasted weeks without encountering enemy aircraft now saw planes daily. Convoys that once scattered under attack now held formation and counterattacked with surprising aggression. Boats that radioed their positions sometimes never radioed again. The operational rhythm, transit, patrol, attack, return, began to break down. Fewer boats returned. Fewer convoys were found. The tonnage sunk, though still significant, began to decline relative to the effort expended. March 1943 was the turning point, though no one recognized it at the time. That month, U-boats sank over 500,000 tons of shipping, the highest total of the war. Dönitz believed he was winning. He requested more boats. He pushed his commanders to be more aggressive. He believed that if the pressure could be sustained just a little longer, Britain's logistics would collapse and the war would tip in Germany's favor. He was wrong. March 1943 was not the beginning of victory. It was the last gasp of a strategy that had already been defeated. even if the men executing it did not yet know. In April, the losses began. Not catastrophic losses, not yet, but a steady attrition that could not be ignored. Boats reported aircraft attacks in areas that had previously been safe. Convoys began to include escort carriers, and the aircraft flying from those carriers carried depth charges and homing torpedoes. U-boats that surfaced to chase convoys found themselves hunted instead. Several boats were sunk in a single action. Crews began to speak of bad luck, of unusually aggressive escorts, of convoys that seemed to know where the submarines were before they attacked. It was not luck, it was enigma. The Allies had broken the German naval codes in 1941, though the intelligence took time to operationalize and was never perfect. By 1943, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park were reading U-boat traffic with enough regularity to reroute convoys away from wolf packs and direct hunter-killer groups toward submarines. The Germans suspected their codes had been compromised, but they could not believe it. The Enigma system was too complex, too secure. Any failures must be due to other factors: spies, careless radio discipline, captured documents. They changed procedures, they added rotor wheels, they tightened security. It was never enough. May 1943 was the month the war turned irrevocably. In that single month, 41 U-boats were lost. 41. It was a rate of attrition that made continued operations mathematically unsustainable. Dönitz, confronted with losses he could not explain, withdrew the wolf packs from the North Atlantic. He issued a directive acknowledging that the tactical situation had changed and that new methods would be required. It was an extraordinary admission from a man who had never before doubted the U-boat's effectiveness. The submariners, when they learned of the withdrawal, felt something between relief and despair. Relief because the patrols had become nightmares, days of relentless aircraft attacks, of diving and surfacing and diving again, of watching sister boats disappear beneath waves that revealed nothing. Despair because they understood what the withdrawal meant. It meant the initiative had passed. It meant the Allies controlled the Atlantic. It meant the war, as they had known it, was over. But the war did not end. The U-boats returned to the Atlantic, refitted with new technology, snorkels that allowed them to run their diesels underwater, acoustic torpedoes that homed on propeller noise, heavier anti-aircraft armament. Dönitz ordered his commanders to avoid aircraft when possible and fight when necessary. He believed that technical innovation could restore the balance. It could not. The Allies were innovating faster. Centimetric radar, operating on wavelengths the Germans could not detect, made night surface attacks suicidal. Escort groups, built around experienced commanders and well-trained crews, learned to coordinate attacks with a precision that left U-boats no room to maneuver. The industrial capacity of the United States, now fully mobilized, was producing Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. For every merchant vessel lost, 2 more were launched. The equation had reversed. The experience of a U-boat patrol after mid-1943 was fundamentally different from what had come before. Boats left port knowing they might not return. They transited the Bay of Biscay submerged, crawling at 4 knots, the snorkel barely above the surface, the crew enduring days of stale air and slow progress. When they reached the operational area, they found fewer convoys and more hunters. Aircraft patrolled constantly. Surface ships appeared without warning. The attacks, when they came, were overwhelming. Depth charges that drove the boat deeper than it was designed to go, hull plates groaning, lights shattering, men whispering prayers into the darkness. Some boats were sunk on their first patrol. Others survived 1 or 2 before their luck ran out. A few, very few, completed multiple patrols, but the men who crewed them were hollow-eyed and silent, their nerves shattered by experiences that could not be adequately described to those who had not lived them. They spoke of hearing depth charges through the hull, the metallic clang as the weapons tumbled past, the moment of silence before detonation, the bone-shaking concussion that made the entire boat ring like a bell. They spoke of surfacing after an attack to find oil slicks and debris from boats that had been alongside them hours before. They spoke of the cold and the wet and the waiting. Coffee became a symbol, not the ersatz grain-based substitute that German civilians drank, but real coffee, taken from captured ships or salvaged from floating wreckage. U-boat crews hoarded it, brewed it in battered pots, drank it black and strong, while the boat rocked in the swells, and the radio man listened for signals that no longer came. It was one of the few pleasures left to them, one of the few things that connected them to a world that still made sense. As the war progressed and supplies grew scarce, even the coffee ran out. They drank the ersatz then, and tasted defeat in every bitter sip. By 1944, the U-boat force had become an attritional meat grinder. New boats were commissioned and sent to sea, crewed by men barely out of training, commanded by officers who had never completed a patrol. They were sunk within weeks. The experienced commanders, the aces who had survived the early years, were dead or reassigned. Dönitz continued to order patrols, not because he believed they would change the outcome, but because the alternative, admitting that the U-boat war was lost, was unthinkable. The statistics are unambiguous. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force during the war, approximately 30,000 were killed. This is a casualty rate of 75%, higher than any other branch of any military in the Second World War. Of the 1,162 U-boats commissioned, 785 were lost. The men who served knew the odds. They went anyway, driven by duty, by loyalty, by the fading hope that their sacrifice might still matter. It did not matter, not in the way they hoped. The convoys kept sailing, the tonnage kept arriving, the industrial machine kept turning. The war moved east toward Berlin, and the Atlantic became a sideshow, a place where young men died in obsolete boats, pursuing a strategy that had failed years before, but could not be abandoned, because to abandon it would be to admit that everything, the patrols, the losses, the suffering, had been for nothing. There is a broader lesson here, one that extends beyond tactics and technology. The U-boat campaign failed not because German submariners lacked courage or skill. It failed because it was a strategy built on a false assumption that Britain could be starved into submission before American industrial capacity could be brought to bear. That assumption was always questionable. By 1943, it was demonstrably false. But the campaign continued, fueled by ideology and momentum, and the refusal of men in positions of authority to acknowledge that the premise had been wrong from the beginning. The submariners themselves rarely spoke of these larger questions. They focused on the immediate, repairing equipment, maintaining discipline, surviving the next patrol. They drank their coffee when they had it, and did without when they did not. They listened to the engines and the sea, and the faint, distant sound of ships passing overhead. They did their duty, and most of them died doing it. After the war, the survivors were silent for years. What they had experienced did not fit neatly into narratives of heroism or villainy. They had fought for a cause that history had judged and found wanting, and yet their individual experiences of fear, endurance, loss, retained a human weight that transcended politics. When they finally began to speak, it was not to justify or excuse, but simply to describe, to say, this is what it was like, this is what we saw, this is what we lost. The Atlantic today is busy with commercial traffic, container ships, tankers, cruise liners, following routes that differ only slightly from those taken by the convoys 80 years ago. The water is the same. The weather is the same. The wrecks lie on the bottom, scattered across 1,000 miles of ocean floor, silent and corroded and forgotten by everyone except the families of the men who went down with them. There is no monument that adequately captures what happened in those waters, no single site where the turning of the war can be observed or understood. There is only the ocean, indifferent and vast, covering the evidence of what transpired beneath its surface. The U-boats disappeared because the war moved faster than they could adapt, because industrial capacity outpaced tactical ingenuity, because the assumptions that guided their deployment were flawed in ways that could not be corrected once the shooting started. This is not a story with a satisfying conclusion. It is a story about the limits of courage, the consequences of miscalculation, and the cold arithmetic of modern war. The men who fought it deserved better than the fate they received, but history does not distribute outcomes based on merit. It distributes them based on resources, decisions, and the compounding effects of small advantages sustained over time. The coffee ran out. The boats stopped returning. The war continued without them. That is what happened after 1943.